Welcome to the Futility Closet Podcast, forgotten stories from the pages of history. Visit us online to sample more than 9,000 quirky curiosities, from a registry for clown faces to a museum on the moon. This is episode 112. I'm Greg Ross.
And I'm Sharon Ross. In 1961, Michael Rockefeller disappeared after a boating accident off the coast of Dutch New Guinea. Ever since, rumors have circulated that the youngest son of the powerful Rockefeller family had been killed by the headhunting cannibals who lived in the area. In today's show, we'll recount Rockefeller's story and consider the different fates that might have befallen him. We'll also learn more about the ingenuity of early sportscasters and puzzle over a baffled mechanic.
Michael Rockefeller had a unique pedigree. He was the youngest child of Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York and later vice president under Gerald Ford. And he was the great-grandson of the richest man in the world, John D. Rockefeller, which made him an heir to the family's oil, real estate, and banking fortune. He was somewhat unusual as a rich man's son. He studied history and economics at Harvard, but after he graduated, he took up anthropology and went to Dutch New Guinea with an expedition from Harvard's Peabody Museum to study the natives in the interior. This was in March 1961, and found that he really liked it there. I sort of get the feeling that if you're the scion of a family that's that rich and powerful that you have to go to New Guinea to be treated as a regular person, and he kind of liked that. Anyway, he kind of fell in love with that area, and when the rest of the expedition left New Guinea in September, he stayed behind and to study the Asmat region in the south, which is a flat, muddy coast with a lot of rivers. He was interested in particularly the artwork there. On November 8th, 1961, he and a Dutch anthropologist named Rene Wassing were maneuvering their catamaran through the mouth of a river on the coast when rough seas swamped the boat and knocked out their outboard motor. They had with them two native guides from the Asmat who immediately said, "We have to get out of here right away," which was true. The guides finally just jumped overboard and swam for the shore because they knew what was going to happen, but promised to send back help as soon as they could get to someone to explain what had happened, which is what they did. Rockefeller and Wassing stayed with the boat and began to bail it, but the current carried them out into the sea where the currents were very rough, and eventually their boat capsized. So the two of them climbed up. They weren't hurt, but they had no way to control the boat at this point. They climbed up onto the hull and just stayed there overnight. And at dawn, Wassing estimated they were about 3 miles off the coast at that point, but couldn't quite be sure. It was probably actually a bit more than that. And he thought they should just wait for help to come. But Michael told him, "I think I can make it," meaning I think we ought to try to swim for shore. It was a relatively unfrequented part of the area. They didn't know how long they'd have to wait. And Michael apparently was kind of impatient or impulsive and just wanted to get to help as soon as he could. Wassing disagreed with that. He said the number one nautical rule is to stay with the boat. Is both the safest thing to do, and also it's the easiest thing for rescuers to see. If you swim in the ocean toward the shore, it's much harder for them to find you. But Michael argued that they should try it. He said it's high tide now, and they're as close as they're going to be right at that moment, which was true, even though they were a few miles off the shore. So they discussed this for some time, and finally Wassing just refused to go. But Wassing said later that Michael's, quote, restless nature made it impossible to endure our drifting around. So at about 8 a.m., Michael tied 2 empty gasoline cans to his waist to serve as an improvised life belt, and then slipped into the water and started swimming for the shore. Wassing watched him for as long as he could until he said they were just 3 dots, just Michael and these 2 cans, that he lost sight of him after about half an hour. The guides, as I said, during this time overnight, had reached the river shore and gone inland and summoned help, and that reached Wassing. A Dutch warship picked him up on Monday afternoon. No trace of Michael Rockefeller was ever found, despite a 2-week search by planes, helicopters, ships, and thousands of locals. They enlisted this huge force of people to look for him.
So he was just never seen again?
Never, to this day. No one knows what happened to him. Rescue parties searched the land while ships and Papuan canoes crisscrossed the waters, and planes searched from the air. They looked for him in every way they could, but never found any trace of him.
Did they find the gasoline cans?
They found one gasoline can that sort of resembled the type of gasoline can that he had used, but it's not even certain that that's the same one.
Yeah, that would be hard to identify a specific gasoline can.
And that's it. And there are a lot of good reasons to be worried. He was 23 and a strong swimmer, but there's a whole long list of things here, unfortunately, to list. He was right that he was swimming against the outflowing tide. He'd set out at high tide, which means the tide was ebbing all day long. He'd set out at 8 a.m. and it was ebbing till 4. So to reach the shore, it's estimated he would have had to swim 6 to 10 miles over 24 hours against strong tides for much of it, and through waters that were known to be infested with sharks, sea snakes, and saltwater crocodiles. So there's good reason to think he never made it as far as the land. But even if he did, there's no clear boundary there between the land and the ocean. There's not a beach as such. The ocean just merges sort of indistinguishably into a mangrove swamp. There's a mud flat there that a life photographer familiar with the area said, "I've been told that a man falling down into the mud cannot get up without help, and Mike certainly didn't have any." The swamp itself is dense thickets of mangrove bushes and roots and goes on for quite a while. There's no hard soil. There's nothing you would actually call land for 10 miles. And remember, he started out having spent 24 hours
right, without food,
already in crisis. The Deputy Governor General of Dutch New Guinea said it'd be very hard to spot him and that he'd have very little to live on, quote, a little bit of raw fish and shrimps. Nelson Rockefeller, his father, and his twin sister Mary flew halfway around the world to aid in the search. At San Francisco, as they were departing for this, Nelson said, "I doubt if I can help in the actual search, but we hope to find our son well and healthy." Nelson Rockefeller was having a terrible year. He'd started out hoping to angle for the GOP presidential nomination in 1964, but just a few days before Michael disappeared, he'd announced that he's getting a divorce from his wife because he'd been discovered in an affair. And then a few days after that, his youngest son vanished in New Guinea. So this was just an awful year for Nelson Rockefeller, but he appeared in the area just to be of whatever service he could be. He and Mary, Michael's twin sister, stayed in Asmat for a total of 10 days. That's when they found the red gasoline can floating near the shore, but as I say, that's not necessarily proof of anything. The Dutch didn't hide their pessimism about Michael's prospects. The people who gave up hope soonest were the ones who knew this area the best. They said Michael's only chance was to have made his way inland through this deadly swamp country and to meet up somehow with friendly natives. But even that was sort of problematic. One Dutch officer said, "The swamps are treacherous. Some of the natives are still vicious. The area is notorious for tribal clashes." And that's why I think, apart from the fame of Michael's family, this story has remained alive, is that the Asmat had until 5 or 10 years recently been practicing headhunting and cannibalism. And the thought is that if Michael made it to shore, it's possible he met up with some of them and that they killed him. The official cause of his death was drowning. Basically, the Dutch authorities decided it was unlikely that he'd ever made it
even that far.
But the rumors persisted. Perhaps he'd been killed by headhunters on the shore, or kidnapped and kept prisoner by them, or he'd gone native and was hiding out in the jungle deliberately. As I say, there's no physical evidence of any kind, period, so it's hard to make any judgments about any of this. But that's an interesting enough theory that's why I think this story has remained alive all this time. In December 1961, this is just a couple weeks after his disappearance, 2 Dutch missionaries began to hear rumors and started to think that Michael had made it to shore but been killed by villagers. Some of them said they'd found a white man at the mouth of a river swimming on his back, stabbed him, and took him to the coast and killed him. They said he wore what they described as shorts that ended high on the legs and had no pockets, which some people think means they were referring to underwear, which Michael was wearing during his swim. They gave the locations of his head and bones, or what they said were those locations, which they said had been divided among the people. And they said they'd done this. They had killed him as a reprisal because of the killings of a Dutch patrol almost 4 years earlier, which is true. In 1958, several village leaders had been killed by a Dutch patrol during an altercation there. It was just sort of confused, and the Dutch patrol thought they were in danger and had fired shots and killed several of the villagers. And the whole culture of the Asmat for centuries had been one of just constant reprisals and tit-for-tat warfare among themselves. So this theory goes that they encountered a white man and killed him as a reprisal for this 1958 killing of some of their village leaders. That's what's said. That's how the theory goes. One of these 2 Dutch missionaries named Van Kessel wrote to the Dutch authorities saying, "It is certain that Michael Rockefeller was murdered and eaten by Otsjanep." That's the name of the village. He said they did not deny the murder, though they also said Tatski is talking nonsense. There's a couple things to say about this. One, it's certainly, you can't say that it's certain in the absence of any evidence that he was killed. But also, when you ask the Asmat about this even today, what they tend to say is, "I don't know anything about that." If you ask them about Michael Rockefeller, that's what they say. And if you press them, if you say, you won't deny it outright, they won't. And people take that to mean that they're hiding a secret. But it seems to me this is only honest. If you ask me right now, if some of our neighbors out there, you said, "We think one of them may have killed someone 50 years ago and covered it up," I'd say, I don't know anything about that. And if you said, aha, you won't deny it, I'd say, no, how could I ever do that? How could I claim to know that to a certainty?
Right.
I can't tell you that. Even if you said, we think the whole neighborhood was in on it. They had killed him, they ate him, they distributed his bones and agreed to cover it up. I'd say, I can't help you. I can't tell you that didn't happen.
Right.
So when the Asmat say, I don't know anything about that, I think they're just being honest. It doesn't mean they're hiding something, it seems to me. Also, if you look at the investigations, the questions that the missionaries asked the villagers, the questions, it seems to me, are leading questions. They asked, was he wearing glasses? What kind of clothes was he wearing? The villagers asked for tobacco, and the missionaries would withhold it unless they agreed to tell their stories to the authorities, which it seems to me is tantamount to saying, if you tell the right stories to the authorities, I will give you tobacco.
Yeah.
Similarly, Van Kessel told the villagers he'd pay 3 steel axes for Michael's head and 2 for his femur, and the warriors refused this. It seems to me there are conflicting arguments here. One of the other arguments that people use to claim that Michael survived, or that he may have come to grief at the hands of cannibals, is that there were reports at the time that Michael himself had stirred up interest in headhunting and cannibalism among these people. The Dutch colonists had sort of been trying to stamp that out and convert them to Catholicism, and there weren't reports of headhunting and cannibalism for maybe 5 or 10 years up to this point. But Michael was interested, among other artworks, in carved and painted human heads, which is what they'd used to create when they were doing this, and he would offer them gifts in return for those. And this argument goes that stirred up interest, sort of a trade in those heads. There was a demand for them now, and so they wanted to get them. The Deputy Governor General of the area said, a few weeks ago it was reported to me that members of the headhunter tribe approached the area administrator for permission to go headhunting, quote, for 1 evening only, please, sir. Meaning they needed a head so they could get these steel axes. So they wouldn't ordinarily have gone headhunting, but they wanted to now.
Yeah.
And that was kind of held against Michael and held it up as an argument that maybe they were more active headhunting at that moment, ironically, than they would otherwise have been. This official said, this was because Michael was offering 10 steel hatchets for 1 head. We had to warn him off as he was creating a demand which could not be met without bloodshed. The headhunter tribes have been pacified, but occasionally bloodshed occurs. Just for the record, Robert Gardner, who was the official at the Peabody Museum who led the first Harvard expedition that spring that Michael had gone on, denied this danger. He said there hasn't been any headhunting for 5 or 10 years, but there are plenty of skulls available. So he didn't make much of that charge. But in any case, it seems to me that if you're willing to say that offering a steel axe, offering a gift in return for a painted skull would influence the villagers' behavior, then you can't turn around and say that offering a gift in return for a story wouldn't do it. If you say, look, I'll give you a steel axe if you tell me that Michael Rockefeller was killed by villagers, at least some of them would be tempted to say that he was.
And they don't care one way or the other. I mean,
Yeah, I don't think they understood quite what had happened or why it was so important or even what was necessarily wrong with that. I'll get to that a bit later. Anyway, I think to their credit, the governor of Dutch New Guinea relayed all this to the Minister of the Interior and added, in my opinion, some reservations need to be made. No evidence has been found yet, and therefore there is no certainty yet. Van Kessel, one of these Dutch missionaries, was considered a rogue who was in conflict with his superiors, and there was tension between him and the Dutch government. So they were taking, I think, what he said with some grain of salt, even at the time. And also for the record, for all their certainty, the missionary stories were secondhand. No villager ever made an outright confession to either of them. And as I seem to keep saying, there's no physical evidence of any kind. Also, it's important to note that no Asmat had ever killed a white man, and that would have been important. It's unprecedented. I mean, they would kill each other within the same culture, but if they had discovered Michael and killed him, there was no precedent for that before, and it would have been significant, I think. The Asmat actually produced a skull which they said belonged to Michael Rockefeller, but a forensic pathologist ruled that this was, quote, most probably not of European origin. And when they actually called off the search for Michael, the missionaries' charges were known, which I think kind of cast a certain light on it, that they thought little enough of these charges that they still went ahead and called off the search for Michael. They didn't think that was going to
lead to anything.
They didn't have a lot of hope that it was accurate, I guess. The writer Carl Hoffman in 2014 published a book called Savage Harvest, where he looked into all this, and he said he'd heard several stories about men from Oostgeneep killing Rockefeller after he swam to shore. He said as he was leaving one of the villages for the last time, he saw a man act out a scene in which someone was killed and stopped to videotape it. And the man said, we must keep this secret. Don't tell anyone about this. But despite Hoffman's book, no remains or proof of Michael Rockefeller's death have ever been discovered. And even he makes the point that all this happened 50 years ago. So if there are any remains of Michael Rockefeller in New Guinea, they're under 50 years of mud now.
Yeah.
And apparently human bones are so common there anyway that it would take DNA analysis to prove that any of them belonged to Michael. Michael wore, among other things, he wore glasses with distinctive heavy frames, and at one point Hoffman was trying to track those down, and finally they gave him some glasses that were just modern wraparound sunglasses. He said the glasses had been a bold attempt at making a fast buck. You get the feeling that they don't quite understand why this is also significant to the people who are asking about it, and they're just either trying to please them or just give them what they're asking for. Finally, it should be said that even if the Azimuth were somehow known to have killed him, the way this is often framed in popular accounts is that he was murdered by cannibals. And I think two things. We have to remember that they were there first. They were practicing this culture in that area for centuries before the European colonists arrived and tried to impose Western notions of justice and morality. But also that even in Western eyes, the notion of murder in particular has a legal meaning. To murder someone officially, you have to take their life and know that it's wrong at the time. And I think even if Michael had made it to shore and been killed by the villagers, they could have taken his life, but it's not at all clear whether the question, whether they knew it was wrong, would have any meaning in those circumstances. You know what I mean? Even if suppose we knew somehow magically that he had made it to shore and that they'd killed him, and if we somehow had it on film and knew exactly which individual had done it, and hauled him into court and convicted him and subjected him to some punishment, it's not clear what that punishment would mean to him. Their notions of right and wrong, and it's just a bit simplistic and I think ethnocentric to say that these are just evil people who killed him knowing it was wrong and then covered it up.
Right.
As if they're just criminals. Their way of life was totally different from that.
But I guess that goes along with your theory, with the theory that this was done as a reprisal for an earlier killing. So in that case, if it was done for vengeance...
But that's different from a crime. It's different from thinking that it's morally wrong and needs to be covered up. They would have seen it, I think, perhaps more as warfare. I don't pretend to be a expert in this at all, but it just seems a bit simplistic to look at it through entirely Western eyes and say that they're all just criminals who are covering up something that they knew was wrong.
Right.
Or so it seems to me. So in the absence of any evidence or any reason to think otherwise, it seems most likely that the decision the Dutch came to in 1961 is probably the right one, that he set out, unfortunately, to undertake a swim that was just too much for him and died of exposure, exhaustion, or drowning.
Or was eaten by a sea creature.
Right, or any number of other unfortunate ends. He was declared legally dead in 1964, and he would be 78 today, which seems unlikely that this mystery could last that long. So I think whatever trouble he got into, he's out of it now. This episode is brought to you by our patrons and by Harry's. For too long, you've either paid too much for a comfortable shave or you've settled for a low-priced but low-quality razor. Harry's offers something you've never had before, a great shave at a fair price. Harry's makes its own high-quality razors, cuts out the middleman, and ships them directly to you for half the price of the leading brand. A good shave at a good price. It's simple. Get the best of both with Harry's. Harry's is the only shaving company that has both amazing quality and low prices. They make just one razor with all you need for a close, comfortable shave. 5 German-crafted blades, a flex hinge, and a lubricating strip. The quality is guaranteed. You'll get a refund if you're not happy. I've mentioned Harry's before. For years, I used an electric shaver until Harry's had me try their blades, and I'd forgotten how close a shave you can get with a good blade, and you can't beat the convenience. Harry's offers factory direct prices, so they cut out the middleman, and there are no upcharges. You'll pay half the price of the leading brand. Harry's starter set, called the Truman, is a great option for new customers and an amazing deal. For just $15, you get a razor handle, moisturizing shave cream, and 3 of Harry's 5-blade German-engineered razors. Plus, there's a special offer for fans of this show. Harry's will give you $5 off your first purchase with promo code CLOSET. Go to harrys.com right now and look for the Truman set. That's HARRYS.com. Enter code CLOSET at checkout to get $5 off and help support this show. Stop compromising. Give Harry's a try today.
In episode 109, I discussed how Ronald Reagan had to invent part of a baseball game that he was broadcasting based on information being telegraphed from the stadium. Greg and I hadn't known that radio sports broadcasts were sometimes based on telegraphed reports and found the whole story quite novel. But apparently this was a whole thing in radio broadcasting for 2 or 3 decades, as I learned after hearing from a couple of other listeners. Gillian Brent tweeted at us, "Read those blind commentaries. This is how overseas cricket was broadcast in the 1930s," and included a link to a YouTube video from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. The ABC explained that starting in 1934, radio broadcasters in Sydney would attempt to recreate cricket games that were being played in England for their Australian audiences. The ABC called it synthetic cricket and shows in their video the radio commentators receiving detailed reports by telex and then broadcasting the play-by-play descriptions of the game complete with sound effects. The announcer would hit the desk with a pencil to mimic the sound of the cricket bat hitting the ball, and they would add in the sound effects of crowds supplied by records. We'll have a video in the show notes for anybody who wants to see how synthetic cricket was produced.
It's great. I had no idea they did this.
Yeah, it actually was really cute to watch the guy like banging the desk with his pencil.
And it's also earnest.
From what I was able to find out on the history of sports reporting by telegraph, it goes back at least as far as the 1890s, when telegraphed reports of sporting events were sent to places like saloons and pool halls. And this seems to have been particularly occurring in the U.S. and Canada. Many consider what we now call sports broadcasting to have actually first started in 1911 in Lawrence, Kansas. More than 1,000 people gathered in Lawrence to watch a reproduction of a University of Kansas versus University of Missouri football game that was being played in Missouri. The results of the plays were being sent by a telegraph wire that had been set up by Western Union at the spot where the game was being played. Each play would be announced to the crowd in Kansas and displayed on a large model of a football playing field. And it's reported that the crowd responded as though they were actually watching the game live, including doing the special University of Kansas cheer.
That would be really, honestly, really exciting at the time.
Apparently, it really was.
Because before that, I guess it was just all you had was newspaper reports, the next day.
Yeah, you'd have to wait for somebody to come back from the game and tell you what had happened. Yeah. Radio broadcasting of baseball began in 1921 in the U.S., and similar to the cricket broadcasting in Australia, in many cases the radio stations would receive information about the game via telegraph, and then the broadcaster and an engineer would recreate as much of the game as they could. And this practice continued all the way up until the mid-1950s, and I found an article by Big Jim Williams describing how he had helped recreate baseball games for radio in the early 1950s. Williams described how the sportscaster at the station would strike a baseball bat hanging from the ceiling with a wooden ruler to duplicate the sound of hitting a ball, and would use a baseball glove in his left hand and a ball in his right hand to replicate catching a ball. Williams was responsible for the other sound effects used in the broadcast and used a small speaker behind the sportscaster to sound like the ballpark's PA announcer, announcing things like "currently at bat is," and he would also add in recorded voices of vendors in the background shouting things like "get your peanuts here," and a selection of recorded crowd noises such as clapping, cheering, and boos. Williams mentions that they ran disclaimers at the beginning and end of each broadcast indicating that they were not live at the stadium, but that despite that, they frequently received calls from listeners asking if they were actually at the ballpark. Such calls were usually being made to settle arguments or bets about whether the broadcasts were live at the stadium or not, and apparently, says Williams, most of these calls came from bars. Williams tells about one game where the telegraph operator came into the control room with the telegraphed report that he had just typed out and said that it made no sense at all. According to the report, a team had just made 4 outs, retired, and then come straight back up to bat again. Similar to Ronald Reagan's dilemma when the wire had gone dead on him, Williams says, "Our confused sportscaster wasn't sure what to do. He began sweating, ad-libbing about the weather, the crowd, the players, the crowd, his kids, the crowd, his World War II experiences, and making up stories about the ballpark's peanut vendors and arguments or fights in the stands, anything to kill time." The standard ploys when there were problems with the wire were to say that there was a rain delay or even a dust storm and to put on some music while waiting for the situation to clear up. So Williams started playing music while the station telegrapher tried to call the telegrapher at the stadium. And apparently when the stadium's telegraph operator finally did answer the phone, they discovered that he was drunk. That accounted for the really strange reports.
That explains it.
According to Williams, the radio station's telegrapher was reduced to begging for information information from a reporter covering the game for a local newspaper, and after about 20 minutes of the music-filled rain or dust storm delay, they were finally able to finish their broadcast. Also on this topic, Peter Sahlstrom wrote and said, I, too, thought the puzzle in episode 106 might be referring to Ronald Reagan's story of announcing a baseball game during a time when the telegraph wire had gone dead. So when you mentioned this in episode 109, I thought you might find it interesting to know that Walter Cronkite actually tells a very similar story about football and actually hints that Reagan may have stolen the story from him. He also provides some interesting background about why these broadcasts by wire were so popular. They provided a way for a small local radio station to provide coverage of a local team's away games. And Peter very helpfully sent a section of the famous newscaster Walter Cronkite's 1997 autobiography, A Reporter's Life, in which Cronkite describes announcing college football games for a radio station in Kansas in the 1930s. As Reagan had described, Cronkite explains that a telegraph operator at the stadium would send very abbreviated reports of the results of each play, which Cronkite would then fill in with his imagination to give long, detailed, and colorful descriptions of what might actually have happened during the play. Cronkite said, the announcer's skill at doing this and the phony excitement he could generate on demand were the keys to success. Cronkite describes how he and his co-announcer, Moreland Murphy, would find out which local fans would be attending away games and would get from their wives descriptions of what they'd be wearing to the games. He said, we got from the colleges in advance the description of their halftime shows and what the band would be playing. At halftime, Moreland and I described local Kansas Cityans in the stands and all the halftime color, while Moreland, at the studio console, played the band recordings. During the game, Moreland was brilliant at the sound effects. For the kickoff, he blew a whistle and slapped a football with a stick that was a pretty good imitation of a kicker at work, and his recorded sound effects of cheering crowds were highly effective. We did such a good job that the Federal Communications Commission suggested that perhaps we should give a few more notices than required that our broadcasts were by telegraphic reports. Cronkite noted that the Western Union service was pretty reliable, but as others have reported, would go down for a few minutes on occasion. Cronkite wrote, these were rare and of short duration, a couple minutes tops. I filled in by simply calling a timeout, who I figured was counting. When the wire came back, the sending operator quickly filled us in on anything that had happened on the field. No problem. Except that for one day for Cronkite, it was a problem, and that was during a very momentous Notre Dame versus Southern California game. After the wire went down and stayed down for some time, Cronkite felt that he had to resume announcing the game. Notre Dame had had the ball when the wire went dead, so Cronkite had them slowly move down the field with it in small increments. He said, now they were getting near the Southern Cal 20-yard line, and I knew I couldn't get them inside the 20. That would make the papers the next day and expose my fictional game. Nor could I have any sensational plays for the same reason. So I kept the two teams moving back and forth as nearly midfield as I could with absolutely nothing of interest happening. That wire was down almost half an hour. It was the longest and dullest quarter in the history of organized football. Cronkite goes on to say, about the same time I was doing football at KCMO, there was a fellow doing Telegraph's baseball reports in Des Moines. His name was Ronald Reagan. Many years later, at some occasion at the White House, President Reagan and I were exchanging stories and I told him of my long game. A year or so after that, I was chatting with some group about that Trojan-Irish broadcast, and one of my listeners said, hey, you know, I was at the White House a couple of weeks ago, and President Reagan tells a story just like that about having to fill in when the wire went down during a baseball broadcast. I won't say the President of the United States stole my story, but... And that's how Cronkite ends it, so we can fill in our own conclusions. So thanks to everyone who writes into us, and if you have any questions or comments for us, please send them to us at podcast@futilitycloset.com. And if there is any chance of my mispronouncing your name, please tell me how to avoid doing so. It's my turn to try to solve a lateral thinking puzzle. Greg is going to give me an odd-sounding situation, and I have to try to figure out what's going on, asking only yes or no questions.
This is from listener Larry Miller. A person calls an auto mechanic complaining that their vehicle accelerates just fine after ignition, but shakes really badly for the first several minutes, then smooths out, and then a few minutes later the engine just dies. The mechanic consults with a coworker, but neither of them can do anything for the vehicle. The caller is nonetheless delighted. Why?
Okay. All right. Did the caller truly have a problem with their car?
No.
Was the vehicle actually a car?
No.
Okay, that's okay. Okay. So I have to figure out what the vehicle is. Is it a mode of transportation?
Yes.
An airplane? Some kind of plane? Some kind of aircraft?
Yes.
Some kind of aircraft. A rocket? Like a rocket ship?
Yes, I'll say yes.
Yes. One that you would leave Earth's orbit in? You would leave Earth
Yes.
on this rocket
Actually,
ship.
yes, you would, yes. It's amazing to me how quickly you go to even something that outlandish.
But go to outer space. I mean, I'm trying to figure out why you're like giving me these qualified answers. Would you go to outer space in this rocket ship?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Because I thought.
No, I didn't mean to qualify. I was just astounded that you got
because I'm
made that
thinking
much
it's like
progress.
a rocket ship on an amusement park, like a
No,
ride or
no,
something.
you haven't.
An actual rocket ship. Okay, so is the rocket ship behaving normally? And they were just calling back to talk to, I don't know, NASA or ground control or whoever you talk to. And
Yes, it was behaving normally. But try to figure out who was calling and why.
Who was calling and why? Somebody on the rocket ship is calling? No.
Yes.
Oh, okay, wait. Somebody on the rocket ship initiated the call?
Yes.
Okay. And they were just happy that they were able to talk to ground control or whoever? Or do I have to figure out who they're talking to exactly?
Figure out who he was calling.
Who he was calling. So he's calling a specific person?
Yes.
Did this really happen?
Yes.
Oh, goodness. Does it matter what year it is specifically?
Not really, no.
Okay. Was he calling a famous person?
Yes.
Is that why he was kind of excited? Because he got to talk to a famous person?
Basically, yes.
Did he get to talk to like the president?
No. He called...
Did he get to talk to like a famous celebrity?
He calls... It's an auto mechanic who he calls.
He actually calls an auto mechanic.
Yes.
Somebody in a rocket or a spaceship calls an auto mechanic.
Yes.
But a famous auto mechanic?
Yeah. You actually nearly there. How many famous auto mechanics do you know?
Well, all I can think of is Click and Clack, but is that, I mean...
That's it.
Seriously, because that's who I thought of, and I'm like, that can't be it, but seriously, that's it?
Larry writes, this is a true story. In 1997, astronaut John Grunsfeld called into the NPR show Car Talk from the Space Shuttle Atlantis during mission STS-81. He described the sensations of acceleration and turbulence experienced by astronauts during a shuttle launch as a joke. Anonymously, not explaining who he was. He said it was just a government vehicle, and then he described
That's really
the sensation.
funny.
The hosts of Car Talk, Tom and Ray Magliazzi, were genuinely in the dark when the call started, but quickly caught on. And I actually looked this up. I'll put a transcript of it in the show notes. He says, I work for the government. He just described it as a government vehicle. He says, the twice that I've driven this thing off the line, when I first started up, it starts great. It accelerates really, really well, and it runs incredibly rough for the first 2 minutes. This is one of those puzzlers. After the first 2 minutes, after this really rough ride, there's kind of a jolt, and then it runs smooth, but only for about 6.5 minutes, and then at that point, the engine dies. He said he tried it with 2 different vehicles of this make and had exactly the same problem with both. So they basically figured out
I was
who he
going to
was
say, Click and
eventually.
Clack figured that out. That's pretty good for them.
Funny thing was, he did the same thing a few years later. He called in again anonymously, and asked about sticking bolts on what he called a 19-year-old vehicle. He said he was using Snap-on tools, which the government had bought for him, all of which was true. It turned out the 19-year-old vehicle was the Hubble Space Telescope, which we had just been repairing. So I'll put that up in the show notes. Thanks very much, Larry, for sending that in.
Thank you, Larry. And if anybody else has a puzzle they'd like to send in for us to use, you can send it to us at podcast@futilitycloset.com. If you like our podcast and want to help support it so that we can keep on making it, please consider becoming a patron to help support the show. The show is a big commitment of time to research and produce each week, so we're really grateful to everyone who has pitched in to help us keep it going. If you want to help, please check out our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/futilitycloset or see the Support Us page on the website. If you're looking for more quirky curiosities, you can check out our books on Amazon or visit the website at futilitycloset.com, where you can sample more than 9,000 oblectating trantals. At the website, you can see the show notes for the podcast and listen to previous episodes. If you have any questions or comments about the show, you can reach us by email at podcast@futilitycloset.com. Our music was written and performed by Doug Ross. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.